the horrific death of Queen Victoria. Inside her bedchamber in Osborne House, her favourite residence, on the 22nd of January 1901, at the age of 81, Queen Victoria was gravely ill. She was a queen who had been on the throne for a huge amount of time, and the impending death of Victoria was a big problem for the nation that she had reigned over. It was such a long time since a monarch had died that the precedent and etiquette of a state funeral had also died out, and not one person in the country had any experience in dealing with this sort of event. But inside of her bedroom, the Queen, who had ruled for 63 years, was slipping away, surrounded by her family. She was a woman who was not very well, and she was also a queen who had suffered with depression and great grief and upset for years following the death of her husband, Prince Albert. But what happened in Queen Victoria's final moments? The year 1900 was regarded as Queen Victoria's horrible year. The Boer War, which had been fought between Britain and Africa, was on her mind, and she was rather anxious about this conflict. But also her eldest son, the Prince of Wales, was travelling through Belgium, and he had been shot by a young boy who was protesting against the war. But then her eldest daughter Vicky, also known as the Dowager Empress of Germany, had been diagnosed with breast cancer that was quickly spreading from other areas of her body, and she was inside her castle in Kronborg in severe pain. More horror came for the frail queen, as in the August of 1900 she was informed by a telegram that her favourite son, Alfred the Duke of Edinburgh, who was a heavy drinker and chain smoker, had died from throat cancer. Victoria wrote, "Oh God, my poor darling Alfie gone too, my third grown-up child. It is hard at 81. But further news would come, and her beloved grandson, Prince Christian Victor, the son of her daughter Princess Helena, had also died as he suffered from a fever while serving with the British Army in South Africa. But as 1900 came to an end, many tears would be shed as the Queen's best friend, Lady Jane Churchill, was discovered dead in bed whilst visiting Victoria at Osborne House. But the Queen was greatly affected, and she was quite clearly not well. She was 81, which by the standards of the Victorian times was rather incredible, and she was once sprightly, but this spark was going. She would not eat as much as she did, and she lost a huge amount of weight, and also Victoria was stuck in a wheelchair, and she could not see very well, and she often became very confused. She had reigned for over 60 years, and no one in Britain even thought about a time without her on the throne, similarly to what has happened recently with the death of Elizabeth II. She reigned for so long that no one had known any different. Because of this, her children would not accept that she was ill, and no preparations were made for her death. Victoria knew death was on the horizon, as she wrote, "Another year begun. I am feeling so weak and unwell that I enter upon it sadly." The Queen at this time was inside of Osborne House, her favourite residence, which is on the Isle of Wight. She would spend her final days here, but the Queen was rapidly going downhill. But the royal doctors had to contend with the fact that the family could not see what was happening. Her doctor, Sir James Reed, who had treated her for decades, knew that Victoria was approaching her final days, and he spoke to the royal family about this, but none of them would accept that Victoria, who was considered the grandmother of Europe, was close to death. They could not even accept this when the Queen was delirious in her final moments. Princess Helena and Princess Beatrice did not believe that their mother could die, and they tried to keep things as normal as possible. But the doctors continued to squabble amongst themselves also, and many members of the royal family, when they were summoned to Osborne, were reluctant to come. The Prince of Wales and Victoria's heir was disappointed that he had to cancel weekend plans, and the Duke of Connaught was at the time en route to Berlin to celebrate 200 years of the Prussian monarchy. Others were at the theatre, but Sir James Reed, the doctor, would telegraph Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, but he realised the gravity of the situation. When he received this, he cancelled all of the celebrations, and along with the Duke of Connaught, the pair travelled to England, setting sail, and he then forced the hand of the royal family to make news of the Queen's illness public and to prepare the nation. The announcement took her subjects by surprise, and one headline reads, "Queen unconscious, sinking fast." But the tabloids had never handled this sort of story before, and they speculated actually that she was getting better. The Queen also, it's believed, could not accept that death was coming, and she asked her doctor, "Am I getting better?" saying, "I would like to live a little longer, as I have a few things to settle." Sir James then said, "Yes, your Majesty has been very ill, but you are now better." Chances are that this was the feeling better than some people experience before their deaths, before they go very downhill. And this is what would happen with Victoria. From the 17th of January 1901, the Queen suffered from a number of serious strokes, and with this the entire royal family was ordered to get to the Isle of Wight rather quickly. The government business then stopped as the Queen could not work and do her duties, and there were brief talks of her son acting as regent for the short period. But Osborne had an influx of guests. There were calls being made to the house every minute from the media asking for news, and people gathered outside of the gates. But Victoria was then sat there in bed, surrounded by her family in her small bedroom. The Bishop of Winchester was with her, along with the rector of a local church, who prayed for her and sung hymns. Kaiser Wilhelm II, her grandson, sat there at her left side for hours, and her doctor held her hand. The Queen could not see, and she said, "Sir James, I am very ill." But James Reed, the doctor, continued to reassure her. He said that she would get better, and nurses also offered support. Seeing Victoria in this state was distressing for the royal family, and there was a great deal of crying from the royal family. But then each son, daughter and grandchild, one by one, was summoned to kiss the Queen's hand and to say their final goodbye. At 6:30 in the evening, on the 22nd of January 1901, Queen Victoria died at the age of 81. The news of her death came out before the new king, Edward VII, had completed the formality of accepting the crown. An announcement was pinned on a bulletin board of the gates of Osborne House. The news of her death spread quickly around the world, and newspapers began to print their editions, and the bells of St. Paul's Cathedral tolled across the city of London. People wore black, and shop windows were covered in black mourning cloth. But as mentioned, there was panic in the royal family, as no one knew what the procedure was to plan a state funeral. Panic also gripped the government, as Victoria requested a full military state funeral. She did not want to be embalmed, and she did not want to lie in state, and she specified she wanted white ponies pulling the gun carriage that her coffin was placed on. She also asked to be buried away from Westminster and St. George's Chapel, and at Frogmore with her husband Albert. Kaiser Wilhelm II offended the royal family, as he ordered a death mask to be cast of Victoria's face against her wishes. But also the Duke of York became very ill, and the royal undertaker who swiftly arrived from London had forgot to bring the coffin. This meant that a local man was called upon to make the coffin of the longest reigning monarch at the time that Britain had ever had. It was said that the organisation was chaos, and when the coffin was built it was sent to Osborne House. The Dr. Reed, along with the help of the Queen's dresser, Mrs. Tuck, helped to prepare Victoria for the coffin. Victoria did not want to be embalmed, so on the floor of the coffin the doctor scattered charcoal to stop smells. They also cut her hair and dressed Victoria in a white silk dressing gown with a garter ribbon and star, with her wedding veil placed over her face. Then after this, the Duke and the Kaiser and the King then lifted her body into the coffin, performing a final duty and goodbye for her. As the family left, the Doctor and Mrs. Tuck performed the secret duties asked of them by the Queen. They placed a number of objects, including the wedding ring of John Brown, her Scottish servant, on her finger, and a lock of his hair in the coffin. The funeral procession was huge, and her cortege crossed the Solent, and a huge amount of soldiers came to London to be involved in the procession. It was the largest military procession since the Duke of Wellington's funeral, and it lasted 2 hours, but during this the coffin almost fell off the carriage, and it was not short of drama. The service in St. George's Chapel was rather chaotic, led by 2 archbishops who arrived too early. Also, the navy was half empty in the chapel, and they needed to have invited many more people. But then the Queen made her final journey to Frogmore, where she was interred inside of the same mausoleum of her husband Albert, and today they are laid to rest next to each other. Queen Victoria was a monarch who oversaw a huge amount of change in Britain. During her time on the throne, she had overseen large parts of the Industrial Revolution, ushering huge change to the country, and she would also become the head of the British Empire, which had a huge renaissance in its power and influence. She became known as the Empress of India, but the Queen, after 63 years on the throne, died inside of her favourite house. Her nation greatly missed and mourned her, and many at the time believed she was infallible and would have lived forever. But this was not the case, and surrounded by her family after being ill for some time, Queen Victoria died. Victoria would have dreamed that her husband would have been with her for many years, and that the pair would have enjoyed her long, lengthy reign together. But inside Windsor Castle, whilst he lay on his deathbed, Prince Albert was suffering, and he had throughout his life suffered with many different illnesses, but he continually got worse, to the point where he lost the will to live, and he became greatly depressed by his constant issues regarding his health. There have been many causes of Albert's death debated by historians, but he was a man who was ill in the last 2 years of his life. But what is the real story behind the horrific death of Queen Victoria's beloved husband? For over 150 years, it's believed that Prince Albert, the consort of Queen Victoria, died from typhoid fever. However, it's possible that he was afflicted with a more serious bout of ill health, as when you look through his medical history, he was a very sickly man, and was rarely ever well. He was killed at the age of 42 by something that had slowly worn down his body, and he had a very serious gastric condition that medicine at the time was not suitable or effective in dealing with. But probably his health was greatly impacted by the workload he had. He was a consort who enjoyed working possibly too much, and he also had to contend with his wife the Queen, who could at times add more stress onto the consort. Prince Albert was also a hypochondriac who, when he became ill, became very depressed and down. When he was a child, he suffered from a number of persistent colds which affected his lungs and voice box, and his German physician would note that Albert often got very tired very quickly during exercise, and he, following exercise, would look pale and shattered. But this doctor also made note of the prince's stomach problems, as when he was a teenager he claimed that Albert's physical condition was not strong, and he would throughout his life go through periods of depress, and he became tired very quickly. Queen Victoria said, when Albert first visited England in 1836, that he could not keep himself awake, and he even fell asleep at the table at dinner, and he could not stay awake speaking with the guests. But Albert did not cope well with being ill, and he always as a child got a sore throat, coupled with inflamed gums, toothache and swollen glands. He also regularly went through periods of dizziness and fainting, and when he got on board a ship he also became very sick. The doctors were concerned that he could not fight off illness, and they were also greatly worried that the same of the disease which were going around society at the time would finish the prince off. His doctor, Baron Stockman, told a friend in Victoria's court that if Albert ever falls sick of a low fever, then you will lose him, meaning that if he got severely ill, then he would die. He was clearly a delicate man, but even from a young age Albert moaned about rheumatism, and he complained about his mobility. But Victoria, his wife, and the Queen would constantly want fresh air brought into the royal palaces, and Victoria was very hardy, and even in winter she wanted the window open. But Albert was forced to sit in the extreme cold inside of the palaces in the underheated residences of the royals. It was noted by the Queen's attendants that Albert would wake up at 6 a.m. and would help the Queen deal with her business, and he was often seen wrapped in a rug, and he would try to keep his hands over a reading lamp. He was clearly a man who felt the cold, and this did not help his health. He was so cold that he wore a big coat indoors, and also a wig, as he was balding, and he wanted to keep his head warm. But one of the biggest problems was a series of stomach issues. Albert's wife noticed that lots would affect his poor stomach, and Albert said that he had been born with a weakness in his stomach. He believed also that this would take him to his death, but he didn't help himself. He would eat meals very quickly and rush his food before going to meet with others on royal business, and he suffered from bloating. Victoria said how her husband was getting fatter and also was beginning to age very quickly, even whilst he was in his 30s. But all of this, coupled with problems in his mental state, could have attributed to his death. Albert believed his whole life was devoted to a sense of duty, and he could not really relax and laugh. He enjoyed time at Balmoral, but he could not let go of his role in the royal family, and he never vented anger or spoke about how he felt. The prince also hid how ill he felt at times, and he didn't want himself to become dependent on his wife, and she did not really help when he was ill. Victoria, despite being very loving, was very difficult at times, and Albert would often get the barrel of her onslaughts of postnatal depression. He was worried about his wife and children, and also government, and the stress did not help. In the run-up to the opening of the Great Exhibition, he had bouts of insomnia, and it was 2 years later, in 1953, that he became very ill with measles. Albert caught this from one of his children, and for weeks he remained seriously ill. Some historians have claimed that this outbreak of measles may have led to him having an inflammation of the brain, but in the years after, there were accusations levelled against him, such as being a Russian spy in the Crimean War, and this also greatly distressed him. He was a man who had a lot to put up with. Further illness in 1855 occurred and brought on by overwork, and he said that, "I never remember having so much work to do as I have had lately." Illness and overwork began to grind him down, and Victoria's response was usually dismissive, and she would refer to her husband's problems as a needless drama. But Albert said that he did not have Victoria's fiery side, but there was becoming a balance between the amount he could do and his health. As the 1850s came to an end, he was suffering still with his health and stomach cramps, and by 1861 his health was so bad that he was suffering with clinical depression. He may have believed that death was on the horizon, but what was causing the issues was his stomach. It was believed that he had typhoid fever, and his symptoms did indicate bowel or colon cancer. All the medical evidence that survives, though, indicates that Prince Albert suffered from chronic inflammatory condition which is known as Crohn's disease. The only other suggestion really is that he suffered from tuberculosis, which affected his abdomen and stomach area. But Crohn's is chronic and is a problem that can be triggered by periods of stress, and in 1861 it was not a good year for Albert. The death of Victoria's mother brought on the Queen's collapse with guilt, and also there were rumours about Albert's son's possible infidelities, as well as the death of his cousin and the Trent crisis. All of this combined to trigger Albert's suffering. Crohn's at the time was not known, and there were limited medicines available at the time which could have helped, and there were no doctors that could have diagnosed Albert's condition either. Following his death in Windsor, the royal doctors put his mortality down to typhoid fever, which at the time was considered a poor man's disease, so they believed it was strange for the Prince Consort to die from this. But all the stresses led to inside of Windsor Castle, the Prince and Consort of Victoria passing away. On the 9th of December 1891, towards the end of his horrible year, William Jenner, his doctor, formally diagnosed him with typhoid fever, but then on the 14th of December 1861, inside the Blue Room at Windsor Castle, Prince Albert died and slipped away. With him was his wife, the Queen, and 5 of their 9 children. He was just 42 years old. In his final moments, his fever had got much worse, and his hands and face also got darker. And his doctor had also noticed that there were pinky purple spots on his abdomen, which is why he gave the diagnosis of typhoid fever. But Albert's suffering in his final days were horrific, and he went quickly downhill. He had, in the week of his death, become incredibly breathless, and he would vomit and become very delirious. Victoria, the Queen, was kept assured that he would get over this, but she must have seen her husband getting more ill every single day. He would cough up horrible mucus and was also complaining of a nasty headache. But for weeks witnesses and those who had seen the prince complained and wrote how he did not look right and how he was very unwell. He would, weeks before his death, continue his royal duties, but he was doing this with very little sleeping. Following Albert's death, Queen Victoria's grief was overwhelming, and many people across the nation sympathised with their monarch. In the years before, they didn't really have much opinion of him, but they now in death showed great degrees of sympathy. Queen Victoria never recovered from his death, and she mourned him for the rest of her life, wearing black as a tribute to her beloved husband. Also, all of Albert's rooms in all the houses and palaces were kept as they had been, and Victoria ordered hot water to be brought to the rooms every morning, and that the linen and towels should be changed daily also. She was clearly in mourning, and she could not let go of her husband, and Victoria also withdrew from public life. On the 23rd of December 1861, inside of St George's Chapel in Windsor Castle, Prince Albert's funeral took place. His body was for some time held inside of the Chapel Royal vault underneath, but then a year after his death the remains were deposited at the Royal Mausoleum in Frogmore. Eventually Queen Victoria would also be laid to rest there, but across the country there were many monuments which were made in his honour, including the Royal Albert Hall and the Albert Memorial inside of London's Hyde Park. Following the death of Queen Victoria's husband, the monarch was never the same. He was a man who, despite his poor health, had a very important role in government and in the running of Britain. He developed a reputation for supporting causes that would make the lives of many better, including the abolition of slavery worldwide. And he was a champion of education reform. But he ran also Queen Victoria's household and offices, and he was a man who was an ideal consort for a queen who became the longest reigning British monarch at the time. But at the young age of 42, the sickly man died inside the room of Windsor Castle, and his death greatly affected not just his wife, but also the nation, as the people of Britain saw their saintly queen suffering heavily. Thank you for watching and support. Please subscribe to Her Remarkable History.